Good afternoon on this chilly, but I say chilly because I'm from here. Beautiful Sunday afternoon, and welcome to Malvern Books. Thanks for coming out for this really fun event I'm looking forward to today. Today we are going to celebrate Daniel Levin Becker, who is an American critic, editor, and translator who joined the OuLiPo in 2009. I'm sure you all know what that is because you're here. He is the author of a book about the OuLiPo, Many Subtle Channels in Praise of Potential Literature, which we have some copies of over there. And it's translated work by Georges Perec, Éric Chevillard, Thomas Clerc, and Paul Griffiths, among others. Today, we celebrate the launch of his second book on the OuLiPo, All That Is Evident Is Suspect, which is the first collection in any language to represent all of its members, numbering 41 as of April 2018. Daniel?
Thanks so much. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all for being here. It's a thrill to be in this bookstore. I'm very happy to come read for you, but I would also very happily just spend an hour looking at these books, and I may actually do that afterwards. So I'll be here if you want to talk. But I'm just going to read. Is there anyone who doesn't know what the OuLiPo is? All right, that kind of crowd. That shaves off like 15 minutes of preamble. So this book, as Joe said, is the first volume in any language that so far as I'm aware, to represent at least something by every single member of the group. And that was partly a challenge, and it's partly remarkable because, especially in the early decade or so of the OuLiPo, not everyone was a writer. We were sort of chiefly writers, but we also had mathematicians and scientists and linguists, and people whose job was more analytical than productive. So a lot of what we included by the people who either didn't write much or who wrote a lot in their own academic fields but didn't write anything you would consider OuLiPian is archival material such as correspondence. That mannequin just caught my eyes. Very arresting. Behind you.
Oh, the pirate?
The pirate.
Oh, yeah.
All right, well, starting over. Did anyone hear that? Anyway, so I'm just going to read a few texts or excerpts from the texts in this book and then be happy to open it up to a discussion. The first text I'm going to read is from a short story by Hervé Letellier called A Few Musketeers. And I'm just going to jump around in it a little bit. That was how it started, trying to bring a bit of order to my library. It was a considerable job, and I set to it immediately, methodically, alphabetically. Allée, Amado, Apollinaire. My shelves seemed even more crowded than usual. I had to move the last of the A's to the next shelf. They say cities expand westward. Libraries, at least Western ones, always grow to the right. To accommodate Queneau Raymond and Sartre Jean-Paul and everyone who came after, I had to install a whole new row of shelves. Until Cocteau Jean, I didn't notice anything amiss. I was proceeding at a healthy clip when a detail interrupted my classificatory revelries. It appeared I now owned a book with an unfamiliar title, The Eagle with Three Heads. I turned it over, uncomprehending. Was this some kind of joke? Who could have so meticulously peeled off the original cover and so painstakingly replaced it with a new one, totally identical but for this infinitesimal difference, and managed to substitute it without leaving a single trace? It was then that I noticed, on the next shelf down, an enormous volume by Dumas, The Four Musketeers. No chance this time that this was the work of a forger. The four was there, embossed on the cover, without so much as a smear, underneath the same glossy, mildly frayed dust jacket as ever. In a cold sweat, I surveyed the titles on the spines of my books. My head began to spin. Jules Verne had never written Dick Sand, a Captain at 16, or Around the World in 81 Days. There was no book by Zweig called 25 Hours in the Life of a Woman. Paper, as far as I know, has never spontaneously caught fire at the temperature of Fahrenheit 452. This was ridiculous. I couldn't even bring myself to smile at the sight of The Postman Always Rings Thrice on the spine of a James M. Cain book, any more than I could at One Orchid for Miss Blandish. Seized by vertigo at the sight of my own 1,001 Pearls for 1,001 Pennies, I lay down on the floor and closed my eyes for several moments. I decided not to leave the house. I would spend the day reading, taking notes. I cursed myself for not having thought to open the Book of Three Ways, a novel treasure of Egyptian mythology, the night before. I had other regrets too, of course. What would have been the new definitions in the Robert Three, or the plot of Maupassant's Three Friends, or the seventh character in search of an author? The telephone rang several times. I didn't answer for fear of breaking the spell. I didn't even go downstairs to take in the mail. This section takes place the following day when he now has a book called Few Musketeers. The hours went by peaceably enough, even serenely. I skimmed Two Men Without a Boat or a Dog, then poor Allais's 1 + 1 = 4. I watched a bit of One English Girl. The postman rang only once, and I didn't have the heart to answer. It was out of the same reticence that I passed over the now banal Bond movie, You Only Die Once. I flipped through The Theater and its single, finding Artaud even more abstruse than usual. Around 4 in the afternoon, my head began to spin. I hadn't eaten anything in nearly 24 hours. I opened the fridge for a yogurt. Bad move. The stench was unbearable. The expiration dates on the milk, the jam, and the pâté had all turned back a year, a month, and a day. I decided to go pick something up at the Zero Creek. My shirt felt a bit tight, but it wasn't until I tried to button my pants that I realized something was wrong here, too. I hadn't gained weight. The scale said I'd lost almost a kilo, in fact, but my clothes had all shrunken a size. After I put on a baggy jogging suit, now it was my feet that refused to fit into shoes with an 8 engraved in the leather of the sole. I called a home delivery service. 29 minutes later, a man dressed in red handed me a lukewarm 3-cheese pizza. This culinary debacle had gotten the better of my last reluctance. It was time to resign myself to a science even softer than my pizza. SOS Psychiatry came to the door in the guise of a small, courteous, smiling man. "Thanks for coming, Doctor," I said. "I think I've got 2 bees in my bonnet." Dr. Lacan, I'll call him that in the interest of doctor-patient confidentiality, stared at me, perplexed, like a mule with 2 spinning wheels. "Come again?" "I want to know if I'm going crazy. I feel like I've got 2 screws loose." The psychiatrist grew white as 2 ghosts. He took out a pack of cigarettes and began to smoke like 2 chimneys. He seemed preoccupied. "I see," he said professionally. "Tell me about your childhood, if you like." "Your mother," Lacan suggested. "She was a good woman, but always at 7s and 8s, 3 minds about everything. One night my father told me when she had 2 buns in the oven." "You have a twin brother?" asked the doctor. "No. Why?" I said, intrigued. "No, nothing, said Lacan. "My mother would make 2 mountains of a molehill. It was just her way. She could drown in 2 glasses of water. My father, that's 2 other stories. He was one person's fool." "I see," clucked Lacan. "Tell me about him, too." "Oh, he was a nice man, but always 4 sheets to the wind. As soon as he woke up, he would knock 2 back. Never had 2 red cents to spend. Never gave 3 shits. Can't say he ever did 2 days honest work in his life. It was like kicking 2 dead horses with him. Mother sometimes got in his back, but he was as proud as 2 peacocks. Anyway, one day he stood up on his own 3 feet and went and plucked himself a job." "I beg your pardon," said Lacan, astonished. "I said he found a job. Plucked, as in found. It's an expression. You don't know it?" Yes, said Lacan, who in 2 fell swoops had begun to take notes. "I was thinking of something else." Skipping ahead one more time to the epilogue. "It seems I'm getting better. Everyone's very nice to me here in the hospital. I'm under constant surveillance, and they record my every word. My case is 5-mittable, no 3 ways about it. At least that's what every 2 tells me. I've started to read again, too, from Tripliners to 11der is the Night. I've just finished 2 painful cases, and in a way I feel Mr. Duffy and I are 2 in the same. It sounds ascetan, I'm sure, but it's not that I'm having third thoughts about my past or fretting about the 2 that got away. No, to me, love is just a 5-letter word. But now I also know what it's like to be minding my own business and to be rattled and upended all of a sudden by an X + 1. Next text I'm going to read is by Michel Odent, who is one of the more recently elected members of the group. She's a mathematician by vocation. And as I was saying before, the OuLiPo used to be sort of split between the writers and the people with a more scientific bent who brought to the group the techniques that the writers would then exploit as constraint or as organizing principles. And in the last few decades, there's been a feeling that there's not enough math coming in. So the group has gone out of its way sometimes to elect mathematicians. And the problem that we've been noticing in the last, since this has started happening, is that every time we elect a mathematician, they immediately turn into a novelist. Much to our chagrin, naturally. So this is, Michel Odent is also very fascinated with Parisian history, and this is from a novel called Comme une rivière bleue, like a blue river, which is about the Paris Commune, which toward the end of the 19th century was a socialist revolutionary faction that controlled Paris for about 2 months before being violently suppressed by the French Republic. It's called No One Remembers. I don't know how historians count the dead and disappeared of that bloody week. Count them. To what purpose? What difference can be seen between 20,000 and 30,000 dead? If you don't know who they were, what they did, or what or whom they loved, what they dreamed of, if they put lots of sugar in their coffee, what's the point of knowing if there were 10,000 more or fewer of them? No one remembers their names, but I know that they lived in Belleville. I'd like to be able to tell you that she was a washerwoman. She would have liked to have learned to read a little better, or she preferred washing at the Espérance on the corner of Passage Cusner rather than at Sainte Catherine, and to be able to explain why, or that she was a florist and drank huge amounts of coffee, or else that he was a distiller. He loved strawberries and the Père Duchesne, which made him laugh his head off. Or else that he was a tailor. He believed in God and liked someone to read the newspaper and posters to him, because he couldn't read fast enough. And above all, because that way they could talk and discuss all these things, which she did, sure enough, so much so that it sometimes came to blows. No one remembers their names, but I can tell you that they lived near the Jardin des Plantes. He was a stonecutter who liked kickboxing. I can almost hear him merrily crunching an apple on the pavement on his way home. And she was a seamstress who loved Tales of the Sea, which she read as serials at the bottom of the front pages of newspapers, because she had neither books nor the time. And then there was that cooper on Rue Linné, who would have loved to travel, and I'm sure he loved blood sausages with large lumps of fat in them. No one remembers their names, or even their existences, really, the ones from the 18th arrondissement, the cook who didn't like wine but never said no to a shot of rum, the day laborer on the Rue Norvin who played the bugle and complained about politicians who were all words and no actions, the cobbler who, before he had 4 children, used to go dancing in Joinville, and dance he did extremely well, the upholsterer who loved marzipan and dreamed of having a garden with springtime lilac, the fan maker who hated spinach, she was far from the only one, and who found the Père Duchesne irritating, she was far from the only one in this too, and the locksmith who was so proud of the way he worked with his precise gestures and who really loathed priests. No one remembers their names, but I'll tell you about some of them, from the 11th arrondissement, the daily working woman from Rue Popincourt who dreamed of having her own garden, who, while wondering what a kiss without a mustache would be like, which she'd like to try just once to see. Or the tassel maker who really liked the large lumps in apricot jam, the coffee merchant who never wore a shirt to sleep. I sleep in the raw, he used to say. The wicker worker who knew of several of Victor Hugo's poems by heart. The typesetter who went to the synagogue and peeled himself a banana on coming back home. The umbrella repairer who had a caged canary and wanted to learn to play the piano. The mason on Rue de Chemin Vert who, when the infantrymen got him in his sights, remembered his cousin's small breasts. They were both aged 30. No one remembers their names, but I'll tell you a few things about them. About the lace maker who all her short life suffered from terrible toothache. The chemical products seller in St. Paul who wept as he thought of his mother, who had died of smallpox and whose only consolation could be found in large quantities of red wine. The cabinet maker who sculpted little wooden toys for the child he was going to father. The blacksmith who went to confession every week, or nearly, and who loved those really greasy fritters you got at the carnival. The shoemaker who recalled the touching way his wife used to raise up her hair. She had died during the siege, and now there were 3 little orphans. The lathe operator who wanted to be a school teacher. The bookbinder who adored grilled pig's trotters and who kept a notebook in which she jotted down what she had done or was thinking. Her notebook has vanished too. Next thing I'm going to read is somewhat older. It's from a book of poetry by Michel Odent, who was the second woman to be elected to the OuLiPo. She was born in Algeria but has lived in France most of her life. And it's a poem in a fixed form that she invented called the anti-sapphic tercet. And it's sort of like a haiku, but the syllable count is 5, 5, 11. And the book is The book is just about 120 pages of these. There's no breaks, no organizing principle. It's just this accumulation of these kind of micro vignettes of everyday life. I'm just going to read in full. The book is called Gesture. She spreads the laundry across the clothesline. The sheets flap in flight toward the windy sky. Sitting on the bench, his legs spread apart, he looks down at the sidewalk between his shoes. Still 1 hour left before dismissal. She turns her gaze toward the open window. The lake in the dream was milky and smooth, something menacing, obscure in the foreground. Adenoma of the liver, says the doctor. How do you not have another drink? Between the thumb and the index, she rolls with nervous fingers, a wisp of her own hair. Translating, so it's sort of a commonplace that translating from French into English, the resulting text will be about 30% shorter, or with prose that's the case, because English has a lot more shortcuts, or just sort of economical ways of phrasing things than French does. And translating this from 5511 in French to 5511 in English, this is one that I translated. And I often find that I would translate everything in the vignette and still have like 5 or 6 syllables left over, so I have to add new information, like the window becomes an east-facing window instead of just a window. He seals the door and all the windows with adhesive tape before turning on the gas. She reaches her arm out of the toll booth to give change to all of the vacationers. Together they drank water from the tap, their lips just barely touching, their eyes teasing. The accident left 21 injured aboard the train that collided with a cow. She finds her oldest son, 15 years old, curled in a ball in his little brother's bed. In the basic course in rifle training, the target's shape is a human silhouette. Immediately after kissing her, he runs to the wash basin to wash his mouth. Each night at the same time, the sound of a piano. Nobody knows where it comes from. I'll read 2 more things. Everyone doing okay? I'm going to read a piece that I wrote called Writer's Block. And when you inevitably buy this book, you will find the image to which it refers on page 272, I think. But the preview is this. So this is a text that was written initially in French for the publication of a monograph featuring the work of a French sculptor named Patrick Pelletier. And the publisher, who's a friend of many of the OuLiPians, asked some of us to write texts. He assigned each one of us a sculpture. There are 9 of them represented in the book. So I got the 6th one and was just asked to write some comments or some piece inspired by the sculpture. And what I did is, there's an OuLiPian form invented by Frédéric Fortet called 99 Preparatory Notes, of which there is an example in this book that I'm not going to read. So I've taken that form and also kind of crossbred it with another form, which some OuLiPians have used, but it's not one that we invented, which is just that every sentence is a question. So this is 999 questions in 999 words about this sculpture. How long do you have to spend looking at a thing before you see a face in it? Does it take longer to find a familiar face than it does to find an unknown face? Or an imaginary one? In this case, do you see one? A face, I mean, of one kind or the other? Vaguely melancholic, but also sort of sturdy and athletic, like a gym teacher from a couple generations ago? Big and strong, cloudy mustache, furrowed eyebrows? Can you have a face without eyes? Do you see eyes? What about a landmass? Do you see a landmass? Can you look at something in a particular language? In which language are you reading this text, for instance? In which language are you, and in which are you looking at the thing? What happens if they're not the same language? Does it matter what language an object was made in? How much so? What other circumstances of its fabrication matter? Do you realize that I have never seen this face with my own eyes? That I have never seen, nor smelled, nor heard, nor hefted it? That I have not studied it from all possible angles? In fact, can I even say with certainty that I've seen all four sides of the face? Would I have been better off letting you believe I know this thing intimately? That I have seen it in the flesh, so to speak? Also, do you see a dove, like maybe holding a Bible in its beak? What is the value of assuming that a person speaking to you about a thing knows the thing? That he or she has already, say, measured the top of it in comparison to his or her left hand? Should I have gone to see it, to do some tests regarding the not entirely flat part where the gash begins? If so, how? Who would have paid? Or is it rather where the gash ends? How do you tell the difference? Is the tip of a rabbit's ear a beginning or an ending? Do you see a rabbit? I don't. Do you see a U or a V? Do you know how the word or is meant to function in the previous question? Where, or rather when, is a V more than half of a W? Less. Same question and a half, but with U instead of V. Did you know I've spent many years taking pictures of interestingly textured walls? Well, how would you have known that? Do you think you would be capable of distinguishing a Norwegian wall from a French one? Without context, I mean? Would you believe me if I told you I could tell you more or less exactly where each wall in my collection is located? The country we were in at the moment I photographed it? What the sky looked like? The relative temperature? Who was there besides me and the wall? Or is it besides the wall and me? More importantly, would it matter? What would such details add, do you think, to your aesthetic experience? Or would they detract from it? Would it have made a difference had I told you I knew the face and the thing in question here, knew it intimately, but did not and do not know the thing itself? Do you see a koala curled up in a tree by any chance? Do you remember the time before the time when everyone had a camera in his or her pocket at all times? To what extent do you suppose the photographs you are looking at right now look like the photographs I am not showing you, but could have shown you, of walls in Amasra or Angre dos Reis or in New Haven? Are we not, the two of us, having more or less the same experience right now, only from opposite sides of the production of the book that you are holding in your hands and I am holding in my head, with respect to our middling but secretly lacunary certainty of the real life and true nature of the thing? Is lacunary a word? Do you know what the thing is made of? Whether it's heavy? I mean, yes, of course it's heavy, but what kind of heaviness? Whether it's expensive? Whether it was expensive? Whether it spits out little puffs of dust when moved, like the cinder blocks that support the bookshelves in my bedroom? Is it made of concrete? Are cinder blocks made of concrete, for that matter? Whom did I mean when I said we? Was it hard to transform the thing between its original state and the state in which you now see it? What was the original state of the thing? What does that even mean? Do you see an owl? Am I wrong to assume that if you were reading this text, you are not also standing in front of the thing in question? Do you know how the word also is meant to function in the previous question? Am I wrong to assume you were reading this text at all? What if you were hearing me read it aloud? What is my voice made of? Is its texture more or less coarse than that of the thing? Where, or rather when, does a detail become a pixel? When does enhance replace shanti? Or when did it? Same question, same temporal bifurcation, but with texture instead of enhance, and context instead of shanti. How long do you have to spend looking at a thing before you see a sex organ? What makes a landmass? What isn't one? Should there be a footnote at shanti? How big? How strong? Do you see a skull? Do you see a tear? What happened to this face to make it look so sad? Can you cry without eyes? Do you see a wall? What have they done to you, my friend? Where did they find you? Where are your eyes? Where will you go? The last piece I'm going to read is the first piece in the book, and it's by Raymond Queneau, who is one of the co-founders of the OuLiPo, and one of those people who, unlike the people I was describing earlier, who didn't write much, and so we had to go to the archives to find their work, was somebody who's written quite a lot, but most of it's been translated into English already. We wanted to do mostly previously untranslated works in here. So this is a very short text. It's called Slept, Cried, and it's undated because it was never published in French while Queneau was alive, and it was found at some point in the 90s in a drawer in the Queneau's archives in Belgium. Started this diary today, desirous as I am to note down my first impressions. Unpleasant. Hot milk, as they call it, is disgusting. Not nearly as good as amniotic fluid. Having been washed and rubbed down, here I am, still blind, back in my crib. Very interesting. slept 20 hours, cried 4. I quite clearly am not taking too hot milk. I also pooed in my linen. Dad says that I'm going to be a writer. He took me in his arms, but almost dropped me. The nanny yelled at him, "She it is who powders my credentials with talc." Cried, slept, slept, cried. I'm starting to get used to hot milk, which I no longer find quite so unpleasant. Read Iphigenia. Followed a finger through space. Quite an experience, as I can now open my eyes. Reread Iphigenia. I pick up this diary after an interruption of 74 years. I feel extremely tired.
So I'm going to be the one to admit that I really don't know much about the movement. Could you give like a really appreciated?
Yeah, so the OuLiPo was founded in 1960 in Paris, and the collective kind of research interest of the group is exploring the literary generative potential of mathematical systems and structures. So a good example, the examples I usually give of sort of the spectrum of complexity is, on one end, there are very simple constraints, like Georges Perec wrote a 300-page mystery novel without using the letter E. On the other end of the spectrum, there are books like Life a User's Manual, which is also by Perec, or some of Italo Calvino's later novels, which use algorithms that were mapped out beforehand. In some cases, the algorithms were furnished by other members of the OuLiPo, that these algorithms kind of dictate how the plot evolves, or how characters behave, or when a chapter has to end or begin, that sort of thing. And the other thing I'll say is just that the group does a lot of work. Those are both constraints or organizing principles that work well for fiction, but the group also does a lot of poetry. And so the haiku, for instance, is a very simple constraint. There's a sonnet, which has its own set of rules about number of syllables and rhyme. There's something called the Sistina, which the group uses a lot, which is every time I try to explain the Sistina quickly, I realize 90 seconds later that I've just been talking nonsense for the last 90 seconds. But it's a poem that repeats the words at the end of each line in a spiraling permutation. So there's a lot of variation on what it means to say mathematical systems and structures, but the idea is that instead of waiting to be inspired by the muse, or instead of combating writer's block, you treat writing as solving a problem or solving a puzzle, and that turns out to be very generative for those of us who are so inclined.
How do you translate, how do you translate something like that, like a book without the letter E or something? Like your thing, like, if it had 999 words in French, how do you translate it so it had that many in English, or does it have that many in English?
What was the last bit?
The thing you read that was by you,
Yeah.
that had 999 words in French, right?
Yeah.
Did it have it in English too, and what's it like to translate it like that?
Well, so in that case, I just translated myself, so I was able to take all the liberties I wanted, and no one would be upset. Translating a book without the letter E is obviously really difficult, and there is sort of a necessary divergence between sort of literal fidelity to what the words are in the original text, and fidelity to something more like the challenges that the writer was trying to solve in writing the book. The first text I read about the guy whose books, the numbers of the books go up by 1, is a pretty good example of this sort of intentional mistranslation, because as the story devolves into this litany of puns involving number idioms, French has a lot of number idioms and English has a lot of number idioms, but they're not always the same. So there's really no, like the last section where it talks about tripliners and 11der is the night, the original epilogue in French talks about 2 other books. Like one is the Le Onze, which is Odyssey in French is Odyssée, which contains 10, which sounds like 10. So but 10, 11 is 11. So Onze is like the Odyssey, but with 11. But there's no, if there's a way to translate that into English and keep both the reference and the humor, I didn't find it. So you just sort of have to replace it with something else and hope that you keep the same spirit. Obviously, it's very difficult. This is a group of people who, in one way or another, are usually attracted to these sort of insane levels of difficulty. And as I was saying to Joe earlier, I know of four different translations of the book without the letter E into English, all without the letter E. And it's been translated into at least a dozen languages, some of which don't even have an alphabet with the letter E. You just take the most common stroke or character in that. It's like, there's a translation into Spanish that doesn't have the letter A, because A is more common than E in Spanish. So there's a worldwide network of crazy people.
How did you become involved with this movement?
So I learned of the OuLiPo's existence in college. My first semester there, I took a French literature survey class, and we read a story by Perec, a short story, and a sequel by a guy named Jacques Roubaud, who's also a very important Olympian. And the professor mentioned in passing that Perec had written a 300-page novel without the letter E. And as it happened, about a year and a half prior to that, with no knowledge of the existence of the OuLiPo or of Perec, I had made a mixtape on which the artist names and song titles did not contain the letter E. So I heard this and I was like, there are others? So I started studying the group still in college, and then after college I got a research grant to go to Paris and work on a project which eventually became my book about the OuLiPo, which is called Many Subtle Channels. And while doing that, the majority of the work I did during that grant year was to help catalog the group's archives, which had recently been sold or donated, I'm not sure, to the National Library. So I worked on that, and I went to a lot of readings and read a lot of books and did interviews with the current living, active members of the group. And over time, I just became enough of a hanger-on that they took my interest and reciprocated it. So they invited me to come to a meeting, and I talked about the book that I was writing, and I talked about some of the ideas I had for forms or constraints. And they listened very politely and told me I had my work cut out for me, and then went on to the rest of the meeting. And then a few months later, I got an email telling me that I'd been elected to the group, which, as the email informed me, and as of course I already knew, came with certain conditions, most notably that once you are a member of the OuLiPo, you can neither be kicked out of the group, nor can you quit. And that includes death. Even about half of the members in the group are still members, they're just excused from activity, but participation in the group's activities owing to their being deceased. There's one loophole, which is that you can leave the OuLiPo if you commit suicide with the express and exclusive written purpose of leaving the OuLiPo in the presence of a notary. Which I'm happy to report nobody has availed themselves of thus far.
Wait, so when you were invited, did you have to accept, or you're just stuck?
I didn't have to accept.
Oh, you did, yeah.
There are a handful of people who have not accepted, but I very happily accepted.
Are there membership fees?
No, they're not There are not a whole lot of expectations around membership besides never leaving. We do have a monthly meeting, almost always in Paris, and initially those meetings were around a lunch, and for the last few decades I think they've been around a dinner. And so you come and you pay for dinner, give the host, it's always in somebody's apartment, give the host some money for their troubles, but otherwise there are no dues. Yeah.
Recently has the group been exploring more sophisticated computers and programming?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that comes up a lot. The short answer is no. I think if you were to ask the 41 members of the group, living or excused from participation, you would get 41 different answers as to why that is. My take on it is that, for one thing, the group is, majority of the group is pretty old and just sort of came of age, literarily speaking, at a time when computers didn't have the same kind of creative power, you might say, as they do now. And also, I am interested in some of the things that are happening with computer-generated writing algorithms or neural networks that can generate things, or even Twitter bots. There's a bot called Times Haiku that just scans articles in the New York Times for units of 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, and then tweaks them out like a illustration. I think those things are really interesting. I think there's a lot of literary potential, so to speak. The PO in OuLiPo stands for potential. And I think there's a lot of great stuff there, but literature, which is the Li in OuLiPo, I think as the group defines it, requires more human intervention, whether in choosing what the constraint is, or in actually writing it out, or in just, there has to be what in this book is variously called an executor or an operator, or some way that it has to be a human intervening. And I think that accounts for the group's lack of interest so far in that kind of production. That could change in the next few decades, but we'll have to see. There's actually, just to plug the book a little more, there's one of the pieces, the second piece in the book is, I think it's the first time anyone spoke publicly about the OuLiPo, because for the first 5 or 6 years, the group's activities were sort of clandestine. And Jacques Duchateau, who died last year, 2 years ago now, went and gave a lecture at this colloquium in Cerisy-la-Salle in France, which is where the members of the group had met 3 years earlier and decided to start this group. And he sort of just talks about what the group is up to. And there's a part where, I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs. Literature and machines has a bad ring to it. It even sounds a priori perfectly contradictory. Literature means liberty. Machines are synonymous with determinism. But not all machines are the kinds that dispense train tickets or mint lozenges. The essential characteristic of machines that interest us is not the quality of being determined, but that of being organized. Organized means that a given piece of information will be processed, that all the possibilities of this piece of information will be examined systematically in light of a model given by man or by another machine, a machine whose model can be furnished by still a third machine, one whose model, etc., etc. I do not mean to say that there is no difference between a machine and a writer. In any case, that is not where our problem lies. But we can admit, nonetheless, that a writer must also process a given piece of information as a function of a given model. Machines will not take to writing their own personal literature tomorrow. To do so would require a degree of complexity they do not yet possess. Still, machines have already accomplished certain feats. We can give them 2 texts and ask them to use those texts to compose a third. This is not a personal creation, but it is a work that could prove quite useful to us. It has always been difficult to live without the service of slaves. It may well be that this is why we have machines. As for knowing what will become of those slaves, that's another story. Until now, writers have enjoyed the service of a kind of portable slave, dictionaries. But over the years, dictionaries have demonstrated a troubling tendency to become more and more imposing. Once again, the master-slave dialectic arises. Hence the necessity of super-slaves, thanks to which libraries will cease to be dangerous labyrinths. But these machines will depend on function by using, at a linguistic level, their own special logical structures. It could be worthwhile to study these structures, even to try to use them. Certainly there is no obligation to do so, nor is it obligatory to insist on limiting ourselves to memory, for instance. We might perfectly well decide that we may only use such information as we would be capable of assimilating ourselves. The danger of this attitude is a certain tendency towards sclerosis. The danger of the opposite attitude, of course, is dispersion. With the proper correctives, both attitudes are possible. I do not believe they are contradictory. That's from 1963, and for what it's worth, I think that's basically still the group's philosophy about the way in which you can use the help of a machine or wherever on the spectrum of modernization you want to name that master-slave dialectic. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Was the movement, or the group a response to something, or was it just a good idea that managed to find other people that
That's-
responded to it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't, not having been around when it was founded and not having found much in the sort of foundational literature of the group about what it was responding to directly, I think it was more the latter. There are certain things about the group that do feel more like reactions. So, for instance, Queneau, one of the co-founders, was briefly a surrealist in the 1920s, and he had a bad falling out with André Breton. And I think the idea that you can't be kicked out of the group once you're a member, and some of the other things, like the group is very sort of conscientiously apolitical, at least as a collective. Individual members can be very politically engaged, but the group has no agenda or party line. And I think those things were informed by Queneau's the bad taste that surrealism and the party line that you had to toe and the cult of personality around Breton. The bad taste that those things left in his mouth.
I feel like I have a million questions, but I'm wondering if there's a visual component or counterpart. You mentioned the response to the sculpture, so I wonder about it sort of if it's like intersecting with artistic movements, and I was also thinking about the Fluxus movement, which is more international but starts around the same time. So I don't know how much of it you can answer, but I'm curious.
So there are a number of counterparts to the OuLiPo. So OuLiPo, the Li means literature, and there are a number of OuExpos, where X is something else. There's something called the OuPampo, which is the workshop for potential painting. There's the OuBupo. There are like 3 or 4 OuBupos for music. There's an OuFopo for photography. There's an OuBapo. Ba means bande dessinée, which is French for cartoon. And that's one of the more active and I think pretty badass groups that's sort of conducting parallel explorations with a different theme. One of the founding members of the OuBapo is a guy named Etienne Lecroix, who has since become a member of the OuLiPo also. And it's a great occasion to mention one of the texts. He has 2 texts in here. This one's called Counting on You. It's an extraordinary text. It's a remembrance of his sister, who died at the age of 50. And it's a cartoon sort of obituary or eulogy in 50 panels. And the first panel has 50 words of reminiscence and a drawing that was made using 50 strokes. The next one has 49 words, 49 strokes, and so on all the way down to the last page where the second to last panel is a single word, which is her name, Veronique, and a contour, which is just one uninterrupted stroke, and then the last panel is empty. It's an incredibly affecting piece. Etienne's other piece is called, I think it's just called Eoderm Drones, and it's an adaptation of a graph theory problem that one of the members of the OuLiPo brought to the group in the 70s or maybe the 80s. An Eoderm drone this is going to be another Sistina-like case where I try to explain it and realize I'm just saying total mush, but it's an adaptation of this thing where you have 5 points of a star and you trace a path that connects each of them in a certain way. And then in following that path, you represent the points. So the form is called Eoderm Drone because that is 5 letters, E-O-D-R-M, in the order that if you were to put E-O-D-R-M along a 5-pointed star and then connect them in that order, you would have a connection between each 2 points. So this is, instead of letters, he has cartoon panels. And so this is a story in which he makes the connections between each of them. It's a bad explanation. It's executed spectacularly, and you'll just have to read. Fluxus. I don't actually know a ton about Fluxus, and I think the big difference, the reason the OuLiPo is not more international, to my mind, is that it's so intimately tied in with language. So there is, there are many non-French members, but the group works in French, so you have to speak at least some French to participate. Whereas something like visual arts accommodates, multiple spoken languages more easily. There's an OuLiPo, which is the Italian OuLiPo that basically just does parallel work in Italian. And as far as I know, that's the only other really organized collective. Certainly there are a lot of American and North American and English and some Australian, just a lot of English-speaking writers who are working in a similar direction, but I don't think they are as organized and, sort of inclined to embrace the protocols that the OuLiPo does. All right.
Thank you very
Thank you all.
much. Thank you. Books are over there. Please eat the snacks and look around.